Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who has joined us online or will late watch this video. Welcome to an executive briefing on the United Nations Biodiversity Conference organized within the framework of the Geneva Environment Network. Our network, hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, includes over 100 institutions or secretariats that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. We have with us today some of the key actors of the Geneva Biodiversity Cluster. This is a busy week on the global environmental agenda with two other conventions holding their conference of the parties. We have seen all along the year that to accommodate the constraints of online or hybrid negotiations, those who follow the environment portfolio in the permanent missions, in capitals or in other institutions have been indeed extremely busy. We are looking forward to welcome to Geneva in January our colleagues from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Geneva, where the resumed sessions of their subsidiary bodies are scheduled to take place. This is one of the motivations for hosting today's briefing in order to prepare the delegations and other stakeholders in Geneva who might be directly or indirectly involved with these meetings. Biodiversity and nature conservation are an important topic for International Geneva, and we have indeed associated to this briefing some of the key institutions headquartered here, as mentioned earlier, engaged in safeguarding nature. And let me just mention them by chronological order: IUCN, the World Wildlife Fund, the CITES Convention, and the Convention on Wetlands. Before I give the floor to Sylvie Motard, the Deputy Director of the Europe Office of the United Nations Environment Programme, who will be moderating today's session, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as a video of this executive briefing will be made available on the webpage of this event. My colleagues will be sharing the link in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions using the Q&A box. We will answer these in the questions and answers session. Sylvie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and I join you in a warm welcome to all the participants to that session, which is very promising and extremely timely, probably. I'll be very short to leave sufficient time to our known experts to brief us and also to have a substantive discussion, but just a few reminders. I think 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature and biodiversity. But it continued thanks to COVID as well. So 2021 has been extremely rich in major events relating to biodiversity. Not among others, the IUCN World Congress in September, the very recent first part of a conference of contracting parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Ramsar Extraordinary Meeting, and not to mention that 2021 was also the occasion of the launch of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restorations. More to come in 2022. CITES in November 2022, the second part of a COP of the Convention on Biological Diversity, also in 2022, and also the UN Convention to combat desertification. So 2022 will also be extremely rich. Nevertheless, all reports linked to all those major events warn about the dramatic state of biodiversity. And let's say major media are talking even about the 6 extinction of species. Meanwhile, last month in Geneva, the Human Rights Council recognized that having a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is a human right. How are we going to reconcile all that in our multilateral system? Right now in Glasgow, the world leaders are meeting to agree on commitments to halt climate change. I think in the view of all of us, or many of us, biodiversity protection and climate protection come together and are mutually supportive. Key drivers are overlapping, and therefore solutions to address the key roots are similar. Citizens are increasingly aware of those linkages and expect coherence of actions. For instance, COVID recovery plans can and should take into account those solutions. For instance, as well, the current pledges we hear about from Glasgow of halting deforestation and promoting reforestation are at the cornerstone of action for climate and action for biodiversity. How are we going to reconcile all those objectives are probably the questions our participants and speakers are going to provide us with today. So I would like to invite Elisabeth Mrema, to Secretary of the Convention for Biological Diversity, to come in and share with us her first reactions and also pave a way forward for the next step in 2022 of what is awaiting for us when it comes to negotiations on the biodiversity agenda. Over to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. I hope the presentation can be uploaded. And while that is happening, let me first thank you, Sylvie, as well as Bruno and all the colleagues at the UNEP Regional Office for Europe and the UNEP Geneva network for organizing this briefing session. Indeed, you have raised an important question. How do we reconcile what is happening under the biodiversity agenda and what is happening under the climate change agenda, knowing very well that the two are intrinsically interconnected and solutions have to be looked together, especially when climate change is looking at nature, biodiversity as part of their major solution. And this is what you have made reference to on the pledges today being made on deforestation, land use, and other ecosystems. So I intend to cover in the next few minutes, first, before I get into the outcomes of the first part of the our conference of the party, which just finished a few weeks ago in Kunming, I will put that into context and take few steps back, looking at the work of the open-ended working group on the development of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and this process leading us now to that first part of the conference and the roadmap moving forward to the next conference of the parties and what will happen. And of course, the engagement of my dear colleagues from the other MEAs, which I sincerely thank them all because they've all been part of this intricate cat journey since 2 years ago. Next slide. So towards the end of August, early September, we had our third meeting of the open-ended working group. This is the working group which was established by the last conference of the parties to lead the process for the development of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which actually will build upon, take the lessons from, and will replace the Aichi biodiversity target of the last decade, which actually ended 2020, but of course, implementation still continues. So the framework is being led by two co-chairs, one from Uganda and Canada, who are leading this process. The first meeting was 2019 in Nairobi. And then we had the last one, the second one in Rome in February last year, just before the world went into a lockdown and everything moved virtually. Nonetheless, consultations have continued during this intervening period. And indeed, the COVID period, unfortunately, the negative aspects of it, both globally in terms of socioeconomic, healthy, and all the losses suffered, it has given us that extra time to conduct consultations with virtually all stakeholders, without which this time will not have been. And I keep saying personally, if not for this extended pandemic period, probably what we have in the draft framework now would have also been different, because it will not have had the advantage of the contribution from the many stakeholders who were consulted during this period. So the last meeting, the third meeting, is the one which was held end of August, early September. It was virtual. And that third meeting did not finish its business because the parties decided they needed to meet in person to negotiate and finalize. So that August meeting was not a negotiation meeting. It was only a meeting to get the views of all the parties and stakeholders. And these have been compiled, collected, and these now will form the basis of the next part of the third meeting in January in Geneva. The value of the August meeting was basically for all participants to hear and to listen what one might say the views of the different parties and stakeholders, because they were looking at the draft and there were all those proposals, remove that word, replaced by that word. So one could say the positions of the different parties began coming out, but delegates were not permitted to comment on anybody's points of view which had been shared. We are only asked to listen, compile those, and these forming the basis of negotiations in January. So those were 2 weeks of meetings in plenary setting with 13 contact groups. And on the 30th of August, the government of Colombia organized what we call the pre-COP at the level of heads of state and government, which again provided that momentum and political commitments of an ambitious post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. One positive aspect of all virtual meetings we've had during this COVID period is the ability to have many more participants attending than what would have been face-to-face. You are all aware, when we hold face-to-face meetings, particularly for developing countries, we'll normally find at most 1 or 2 delegates. But with the online, all delegates could attend. So you could see on the screen the volume or the number of participants who were able to attend, both parties and observers. And that meeting considered all elements of the first draft framework, which was launched way back in July. And again, as I said, really giving issues, comments on each and every paragraph without discussing, without getting the views of others. We have a controversial issue in the name of digital sequencing information on genetic resources, which is still yet to be decided whether it will be part of the framework or will be treated separately. So the third meeting had for the first time also consideration of digital sequencing. And the meeting actually ended up establishing an informal working group, which has still been discussing the issue during this period to report at the January meeting. Next slide. So what were the key points, which probably I've already mentioned from that August-September meeting? We've heard the views on the text of the first draft. We could tell where each delegate is coming from, and we can tell which probably could be controversial issues during negotiation as the result of that. We have seen this record number of participants who were able to attend, and surprisingly, literally the number did not shrink throughout the 2 weeks. If anything, it kept the number of participants increasing. So convergence issues are known now, areas of divergence even more clearer, and we know January might not be an easy task to bring the divergence areas into convergence, but good support, at least on that document. And now the next steps. Next slide. So where are we heading from here on that? As I said, the formal negotiations, which will be the second part of the third open-ended working group, will be in January. Actually, January we'll have 3 back-to-back meetings. We'll have a SubStar, or the subsidiary body on science, and SBA, which is the subsidiary body on implementation, as well as the third meeting of the open-ended working group. All these 3 meetings will be meeting actually as the second part, because they all had their first part this year. SubStar and SBI were held in May, virtually in May, June. And the SubStar and SBI also still have mandates to contribute elements to the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Hence, they need to meet to complete those recommendations, which we'll get into now, the open-ended working group. And all this will be in January, thanks to the government of Switzerland for hosting these meetings, and consultations are continuing currently in terms of preparing for those meetings, including we ourselves preparing a scenario of how these meetings will be held, and not necessarily that will be one after the other. There will be a combination of meetings in between. So a lot of work to make sure the Geneva meetings really lead us to the final text ready for the second part of the conference of the parties. So going now, next slide, to what happened at the first part of the conference of the party, which actually was, one can say, a hybrid in the sense that although no delegates outside China were able to travel to China, to Kunming, for this first part of the meeting, except the 5 of us from the Secretariat, the rest of other delegates were those already in China, already accredited to China. So the ambassadors and many international organizations which have representation in China. So those attended in person, while the rest of the world attended virtually. So what did we, or how that first part was laid out? We had first the opening, we had the conference of the parties itself, and then we had the leaders summit led by the president Xi of China. And then we had the high level segment, where this is where the ministers spoke, about 97 of them, and then completed with the adoptions of decisions at the COP itself. And when I talk of the COP, or Conference of the Parties, is the Conference of the Parties for the convention itself, but also meeting of the parties of the 2 protocols under the convention. And this is the Cartagena Biosafety Protocol and the Nagoya Access and Benefit Sharing Protocol, normally also meeting back to back, one after the other. What were achieved? At the Leaders Summit, we got that confirmation of the political commitment and impetus. This is where, and the leaders who spoke include, in addition to President Xi of China, Macron of France, President of Colombia, His Royal Highness Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, who else? I seem to be forgetting others, but at least 7 of them spoke. the president, that's where he announced the establishment of the Kunming Biodiversity Fund with $233 million on it, and inviting other governments and partners to also contribute to the fund. From France, 30% of the climate fund will be spent or go to biodiversity agenda. And the same was also from UK, Royal Highness, that the UK percentage amount of climate fund will be spent on biodiversity preservation. And UK also, in addition, contributed 200,000 pounds to help us steer this ongoing process, and did so to show the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, and has supported this negotiation process. So these were some of those announcements at the Leaders Summit. At the high level segment, a Kunming declaration was adopted, again underlining that commitment to negotiate a transformative, ambitious biodiversity framework that will be effective, hopefully, to bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and really matched with the necessary resources and with the effective mechanism to review and monitor progress for its implementation. The COP itself had progress reports, particularly from the co-chairs of the Post-2020 Framework, as well as from the subsidiary bodies on science and implementation, and also discussed and adopted the interim budget for the convention and the protocol. Interim budget because last year we had to have an extraordinary session for us to have a budget for 2021 until when the COP meets. So with the postponement of the COP, again, we needed a budget for 2022, and this is what was also adopted. Next slide. And the next one. In terms of pledges, yes, Japan, which had established a biodiversity fund, you recall Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted in Japan for the COP held in Japan 2010. Japan had established a fund to support implementation of the Aichi targets and the strategic plan which was adopted then. So that fund continues with an additional $17 million, particularly again to support national actions and strategies for the implementation of the framework when it is adopted. Germany increased its investment by 50% on biodiversity conservation. Yes, the Global Environmental Facility, in partnership with UNEP and UNDP, are ready or committed to fast track in terms of avoiding any delay, but currently already now to begin preparing the countries ready for the startup of implementation of the framework when it is adopted, in terms of developing their national targets and integrating them into their national strategies and actions. So really fast track, because with the Aichi biodiversity target, many countries began implementation after 4 or 5 years. Much as we are talking of a decade, in actual fact, it was probably half a decade of implementation, because many countries began developing and reviewing and updating national biodiversity strategies and action plans and began before they began implementation. So the idea is to avoid that, and now learning from that is what now GF, UNEP, UNDP will help the countries to be able to move forward quickly. All the ministers who spoke really we had increased national commitments and domestic actions planned and already taking place on biodiversity. So have a clear view of what is happening at national level in many countries and what are the plans. And we hope once the implementation, the framework is adopted, it will be easier for countries to move straight in terms of determining and increasing their ambition on the national targets. Inspiring statements from other stakeholders, the UN system, the private sector, local communities, the youth, all demonstrating their commitment for action on biodiversity and really calling on the leaders to commit to taking action as expected. Next slide. So again, other announcements which were made during that first part, and it was interesting and really encouraging also to hear commitments, particularly from the private sector. And you know, from the private sector, we began hearing even before the first part of COP itself, the 5 billion from the philanthropies, the 75 financial institutions representing 12 trillion euros and in 17 countries committing to take 5 steps that the institution will take to protect and restore biodiversity through their financial activities. The European Union doubling its external funding from 5.5 to 6 billion euros. 500 business organizations which are currently profiled into what was initiated by Egypt, our last COP presidency, and upcoming president, now the president China, Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming action agenda, where businesses are profiling their actions they are taking on biodiversity. So, and many others we've seen of the CEOs signed open letter urging heads of state to really also adopt ambitious post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So there is really that support coming on post-2020, but also taking action to protect and restore biodiversity. And me also being privileged to co-chair the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. This is where we are working again with corporate and financial institutions to be able to assess the risks and impacts of their activities and their dependencies on nature, because we all know the economic value of nature, with half of the global economy dependent on nature. So it's really gratifying to see the private sector joining hands in this process. There were a few other events which were also organized within the first part of the COP. Particularly, there was the 2 full days of Ecological Civilization Forum organized by China, and this is where multilateral corporations and different government sectors, private, public, civil society participated, and further also not only exchanged innovative approaches and practical work, but also demonstrated what they're intending to do, again, to protect and restore biodiversity. We had also 2 days NGO Action Forum, which was 2 days before the Conference of the Parties itself, where non-state actors again met to discuss raising ambition around the post-2020 framework. Immediately after COP, organized by the CBD Secretariat in collaboration with other partners and organizations, we had a whole week of Business and Biodiversity Week, again to engage corporate businesses, private sector, gave them that space to exchange views and also get their participation in this process. Next slide, I think. So what have we learned from the virtual hybrid meetings, particularly from the first part of the meeting? I said participation, great. All sessions successfully were able to have them virtually and that physical setting. Of course, there were a few issues of some speakers to speak with internet connectivity. Surprising, all the difficult incidences were from the developed world. So the connectivity issue is not only basically showing not only developing countries issue, but it can also happen for the developed world. And this is what we saw during the meeting. So participation was great, open, consultative, and the like. Next slide. And the next one. What is our roadmap now moving forward? This week, we are all observing and attending the climate change, which is coming after the first part. So the meeting in Glasgow has the outcomes of our biodiversity. Climate change and biodiversity are inseparable. They cannot be separated. As Sylvia mentioned, we are hearing this our morning here, pledges on deforestation, on land use and other ecosystems, clearly showing the commonality of the solutions on these two crises. So in January, already indicated, we'll have those 3 meetings resumed, but formal negotiation. All previous 2 years had been virtual, so it will be key to see first seeing each other after 2-3 years. So that by itself, hopefully will create that momentum to negotiate. And hopefully then that openness will create that flexibility and openness to get the compromises for the negotiation. And the meetings will start on the 12th until 28th January in Geneva. What are some of the key challenges, particularly as we see from the compilation of the viewpoints coming from the August meeting? How is basically, first, how will we ensure everybody talks of ambitious, transformative framework? What will compose that ambition, that transformative, to really meet the goals and reach the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, and really be able to address the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss? So I think what we mean by ambitious, transformative might be an issue. Will we have the political ambition commensurate with the ambition in finance and other fields? And we are looking at GF being the financial mechanism for the convention to see how the 8 replacement also will fill that gap. And of course, the support already committed from GEF plus UNDP and UNEP. Mechanism to track implementation. And this is where my major lesson was learned from the Aichi biodiversity target. And I'll put this together to track implementation. So the framework will also be accompanied with what we call means of implementation, which will be an action plan on capacity building, technology transfer, an action plan for gender engagement, a review, monitoring, accountability framework, as well as also resource mobilization strategy, all forming that means of implementation component. So how will all these negotiations then be able to build on that, particularly also on the finance aspect? And we hope then that leadership commensurate with these step changes needed for negotiations. We hope this process, and now from the climate change, hopefully will lead now to positive negotiations as we move to Geneva in January. To complete, we hope and looking forward that really the framework will be a universal framework as intended for all stakeholders, organizations, including our MES, and particularly for MES because we are talking of the same parties. If CBD is 196, almost universal, I know CITES is also virtually universal, and also the other MES. So we are dealing with the same governments. We are talking of the same governments. And we hope that the engagement of all parties, the engagement of the MES Secretariat, for which we are very thankful, will also enable the other MES to also pick the framework when it is adopted and be able to be aligned with their own strategies and action plans, so the implementation becomes one piece and not different pieces. And we also hope that all MES can already see themselves in the draft framework. The different stakeholders, we hope now they can already see themselves in the draft framework. Of course, January meetings, we are looking for these different targets to be further strengthened. But if the MES main areas of focus are reflected, the stakeholders are engaged, we hope then actually implementation will also be by everybody and not just biodiversity parties. The UN system has been engaged, and this is where we sincerely thank the Geneva Network. We thank the UN Common Approach on Biodiversity, the Environmental Management Group already bringing the UN system together so that, again, together we can work and collaborate together for the implementation of the framework when it is adopted. So the endorsement by the CBD parties, hope will also lead to the endorsement by all other partners as well as MES. And hopefully that's the only way then we'll be able to converge and foster harmonization, complementarity, synergies in the implementation of all related MES and organizations as we strengthen the achievements of these of your own objectives in response to bending the curve on biodiversity loss. So I think I will stop there. And the last slide is just basically further information of this process. Thank you very much, Sylvie.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for setting the scene. That was extremely interesting, and I really thank you very much for conveying hope through your presentation. The momentum seems to be there. And actually, as you called on other MEAs to be fully engaged, allow me to turn to Yvonne Higuero, who is the Secretary General of the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species. I'm sure she will have some answers to that. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Sylvie, and of course to the Gen for this invitation. Good afternoon, Excellencies and colleagues online. Very much, firstly, I would like to say congratulations to you, Elizabeth, for your leadership in moving the biodiversity agenda forward in spite of the challenges that we are all facing during this last year and a half. And thanks very much for this helpful update. And as Sylvie says, I think some of what I'm going to say will respond to some of those ambitions or wishes that Elizabeth has. For many of you know the convention, but just in case, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES as we call it for short, came into effect in 1975. So it is an old convention and it is well recognized as a successful convention. But it addresses only one part of the biodiversity jigsaw. The international trade in wild species of fauna and flora is the focus. And this is why it's so important to have a global biodiversity architecture. It's vital to ensure that our nature is conserved for future generations. As Elizabeth mentioned, the way we work together as secretariats of biodiversity-related conventions, 8 of the major global biodiversity conventions, we operate through this group called the Liaison Group of Biodiversity-Related Conventions, and we have been very active throughout the negotiations of this global biodiversity framework, emphasizing the unique contribution that each of our conventions can make to ensure its success. And therefore, speaking to the wishes of Elizabeth, we have been urging that the mandates of our respective conventions be woven into the framework to make full use of the activities undertaken by each convention. Also, the plan monitoring framework that is to come and is being planned that is being worked on right now, should already incorporate the data, which we have a lot of, and indicators which are already being used by the various biodiversity conventions to track progress. This is a really important aspect of creating these frameworks with objectives and targets. At the end, you will need to be able to show progress, and this is through indicators. Crucially, we believe that focal points of each convention at national level must be engaged to ensure the development and implementation of powerful yet inclusive, and this is really important to keep in mind. These national biodiversity strategic action plans must be inclusive, taking into account all of these biodiversity related conventions and perhaps others that are related to biodiversity, to be able to deliver on commitments at the national level. Now, CITES regulates international trade in specimens of species so that it is legal, sustainable, and traceable. We are therefore very pleased that there is a target in the current draft of the post-2020 framework aimed at ensuring that the harvesting, trade, and use of wild species is sustainable, legal, and safe for human health. So this also refers to what Elizabeth was speaking about, that the conventions can see themselves in this global biodiversity framework and then be eager to contribute to it. So we aim as CITES to contribute to the development of indicators also for this target to measure progress. There are a number of other draft targets that are also relevant to CITES, and in particular those addressing the recovery and conservation of species and ensuring benefits for people, especially vulnerable people, indigenous peoples, and local communities. This is a really big focus of CITES when we talk about sustainable management of wildlife. Within our mandate, we will be pressing and continue to press for the maintenance of these aspects of the framework and the elaboration of their wording to ensure that targets are clear, smart, and ambitious. Now, also some of the enabling conditions to which Elizabeth referred to, and one of them is that its efficiency and effectiveness will be enhanced by integration with relevant multilateral environmental agreements, including through the strengthening or establishment of cooperation mechanisms. We have some existing joint work programs. We have our cooperation mechanism through the Biodiversity Liaison Group. We wish to have more of this, and this is something that we very much endorse to keep in the framework. Now, in their own strategic vision, 2021 to 2030, the CITES parties have recognized that their efforts to implement the convention may also provide benefit to and draw strength from the global biodiversity framework developed by parties to the CBD. As part of a goal of contributing to and learning from international efforts to achieve sustainable development, the CITES parties have set an objective of ensuring the recognition of the convention's role in achieving the objectives of the framework. So already within the framework that has been developed through the vision of the parties of CITES, they have already recognized that it's very important to be a part and contribute to these objectives of the framework. And we hope that we can only strengthen that as we move towards the acceptance and the adoption of this framework. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to confirm here that our parties, CITES parties, the CITES Secretariat, are committed to a very ambitious global biodiversity framework to halt the loss of biodiversity and realize our common vision. And this is what's important too. This vision is common, not only amongst the multilateral environmental agreements dealing with biodiversity, but amongst the colleagues who are sitting here from NGOs, from international organizations, from UN organizations also mentioned by Elizabeth. This is a common vision of living in harmony with nature. The CITES parties stand ready to contribute within their own mandate aligning their efforts wherever possible, and working collaboratively to meet and even exceed the new goals of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. You may count on our full support. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. That was very clear and very much appreciated, I think, by Elizabeth and all of us. And I really like indeed what you mentioned as a biodiversity jigsaw and the need for the global architecture. So in that context, let's turn to our next panelist. Can I call Marta Rojas-Orrego as the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands to come in?
Thank you.
Marta, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I would like to thank the GEN Network for organizing this very timely briefing. It is a pleasure to see my sister conventions and colleagues. And this is a very timely moment as we are finishing the part 1 of the COP15 and then moving to the second one while we have the Climate Change Convention COP going forward. So my points are also very much on the lines that Elizabeth was asking, from us, biodiversity-related conventions, and from what we heard from Yvonne. I have to say that we have been working very closely with the CBD in the development of the Global Biodiversity Framework because this is a priority for our parties. And I would like just to provide a couple of highlights that I see, in terms of the first part of the COP15 having taken place. To secondly, talk a little bit about this collaboration, or Sylvie, you mentioned reconciliation, among all these different initiatives and agreements. To thirdly, provide some examples of how we can do that and how we are doing that, and to finally give some points about how we see moving forward. So regarding the outcomes of the COP15 first part, I would like to just join Elizabeth in recognizing that it was really important in terms of building and keeping the momentum and re-engaging in the sense of urgency of taking action. And I think that Elizabeth very well mentioned all the declaration, the commitments, the announcements, and all that is really important to get the level of ambition. This is the word, I agree with Elizabeth, that we need to turn the tide on biodiversity loss. But of course, it was also important in terms of shaping further the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we hope that this is going to be very useful as we move towards the phase of negotiation face to face. I think that a main point that I wanted to highlight is the recognition in the declaration and in the statements and commitments that the biodiversity crisis that we're living requires unprecedented action, and that all efforts need to be mobilized towards common goals. I think that there was a broad recognition that although there has been a lot of work, we know what is needed. The Aichi targets were not met, and that we really need to make progress, and we are far from being in the right path. There was also recognition about the importance of biodiversity and nature for development, for health with the COVID crisis, the relationships with climate change, land degradation, pollution, and all this, I think, is a very solid foundation on which we need to move forward. So biodiversity is not a separate agenda, it's something that concerns all of us. And it said very clearly that for this, to get the level of ambition, we need enhanced collaboration and coordination. And I think that this is where the role of conventions like ours, Yvonne mentioned CITES, and I will of course mention the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, are absolutely key. So in terms of our convention, what I have to say is that the parties have expressed for the last 2 triennia the importance of being aligned and contribute and being part of the biodiversity framework. And it is interesting to see that each one of these conventions provide actually important pieces of this biodiversity framework. And they imply that our parties, we have 172, have developed already legal frameworks for particular aspects. They have developed policies, they have developed tools, they have they are implementing. So these are mechanisms that are absolutely critical if we are to get the ambition that we need in biodiversity. So the importance of recognizing the contributions of these conventions is absolutely key. And if I speak about the Convention on Wetlands, we know that this particular ecosystem houses 40% of biodiversity, and that many of the services that we get from wetlands, including for climate change, are under threat, and that we're losing wetlands faster than any other ecosystem. So if we are to have the level of ambition on the biodiversity framework, it's really important that we mobilize and that we leverage what the parties do under this convention as a contribution to the global biodiversity framework. This would maximize our impact, avoid duplication, and this provides also an opportunity to have the biodiversity framework as a unique opportunity to have this unity. I think that there is a lot of talk about synergies, and efforts have been made in terms of getting synergies at the end of the road. So the parties of each convention take decisions, and then we say, let's get synergies. And that's very difficult. But if the Global Biodiversity Framework already includes what these conventions do, the indicators that they provide, the data that they provide in each one of the areas of work, we will have a unifying framework, and then synergies will happen. So I think that this is a very important point, and I'm very grateful for the leadership of Elizabeth in engaging with these conventions, in the mandate that the parties to the CBD have given in terms of the importance of including these conventions as somehow implementation arms to achieve particular aspects of each one of the elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the good news is that we're not starting from scratch. So as Yvonne said, in our case, the parties are committed. I have to say that the strategic plan of the Convention on Wetlands is already aligned with the Aichi targets, and the midterm review was planned in a way that the mandate is to align it to the Global Biodiversity Framework. So work is undergoing and waiting for the framework to be ready so that the strategy continues to be aligned with the biodiversity framework. The contributions that the convention does in terms of conservation of wetlands, with, for example, more than 2,300 wetlands of international importance, which is the largest global network of protected areas, will contribute to the 30-30 target. We apply wise use, the sustainable use, which is also a major aspect of the Kunming Declaration. Gender mainstreaming, we have a resolution on gender and ongoing work. So all these will contribute to these elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So in addition to having this alignment, we have collaboration. So to give you an example, the Ramsar Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity have a joint work plan to implement the Inland Waters Program of the CBD. We have collaboration with other conventions, so we need to draw on that so that this complementarity continues to happen and that we build on that. And one of the points that Elizabeth mentioned was the importance of having a robust monitoring framework. So we as conventions have already indicators, national reporting that are contributing to particular targets and indicators of the emerging global biodiversity framework. And to give you an example, there is in the framework an indicator on the state of particular ecosystems. Well, our convention through national reporting is already contributing to the extent of water-related ecosystems, which is also an SDG. So SDG 661 measures the same. So here is an example of how to, by using what our conventions provide as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we will have a direct avenue of collaboration, synergies, and effectiveness. So to finish, moving forward, just a few thoughts on how we see, what it's needed in order to have a successful GBF in 2022. So first of all, the framework needs the ambition that is commensurate with the level of loss that we are seeing and with the means of implementation. And this includes finance, addressing the drivers, capacity building. As Elizabeth said, this has to be a common framework for all, including for our conventions. It has to explicitly recognize, not only in terms of the text, but also in terms of the way of implementing it, the role of the biodiversity-related conventions, so that they can contribute according to their own mandate in the areas where there is clearly an alignment and a direct contribution. We need to use existing instruments and tools. We have to avoid duplication. We have seen that there is a risk of duplicating efforts, and absolutely this is something that we need to avoid. We need to use the relevant targets and indicators, and even more so, those that are already tracking other processes as the SDGs. We need to create connections and synergies at the national level, as Yvonne said, in the context of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, so that the work that we do, our conventions do at national level, are integrated at that level. And we need to have collaborative means in terms of the implementation. So as mentioned in the Kunming Declaration, we need integrated action. We need to get together and to achieve the biodiversity framework ambition needs not only unprecedented efforts, but that we draw on existing instruments that we have been building during the last 50 years, and to use this work of the parties and technical bodies to be leveraged to achieve this ambition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta, for your very well, substantive perspective and contribution. This is your call for further coherence is very much welcome, and that led me to think also to what you mentioned as convention as implementing arms of a global biodiversity framework. Let's also not forget regional conventions, which can be also very interesting and useful implementing arms. If you allow me for now, also for the sake of time, may I turn to Trevor Sandwith, who is Director of the Center for Conservation Action of the International Union for Nature Conservation. Trevor, over to you.
Thank you. You can hear me, I assume. Thanks, Chair Sylvia, and for the invitation to participate in this, and good day to everybody. It gives me great pleasure to represent our Director General, Dr. Bruno Oberle, today, as he's leading our delegation in Glasgow and couldn't be with us at this time. But I hope to echo many of his words in this briefing. Just to go one step back, it was mentioned a little earlier that in September, IUCN's 1,500 members discussed the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the World Conservation Congress in Marseille in France, and adopted resolutions accordingly, including one to develop and implement a transformational and effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And that empowers our state, civil society, and indigenous peoples members as we engage with this first part of COP15 and as we go forward to the next steps. IUCN subsequently took part in the, I was mentioning participation in the high-level segment and in the forums on ecological civilization and other events in Kunming recently. But our union really has strongly affirmed, I mean, this is the standpoint of IUCN, that the GBF must be fit for purpose. It must adopt ambitious goals and targets to address the loss of nature, together with the linked challenges of climate change and land degradation that other speakers tonight have already spoken about. I'll perhaps touch on a couple of issues that are very germane to IUCN's involvement in this. We really emphasize that there's some specific aspects, all of which are actually currently part of IUCN's program and which we are getting on with post the World Conservation Congress. We must protect 30% of the planet by 2030. The science underpins that ambition. Protected and conserved areas across the regional seascape and landscape are able to conserve biodiversity, but only if they are effectively managed and equitably governed. Rather than being regarded as a risk to people's rights and responsibilities, we in IUCN regard this as one of the most powerful opportunities yet available to respect, support, and defend the territories and areas of indigenous peoples and local communities as part of this global action. And many have emphasized the importance of that. Conservation of nature has been going on through millennia, and we have to empower it to be able to continue that. As many of you know, IUCN has also really tried to raise the bar on this and enshrine the elements of an ambitious target in a standard, which we known as the IUCN Green List Standard for Protected and Conserved Areas. We're ready to work with parties to support an ambitious target on area-based conservation, concerned not only with what is conserved, in other words, the most important biodiversity, but how it is conserved, how it respects the rights and processes and justice of people, and how it meets the goals for nature and for society. These are inextricably important elements of this process. And of course, we also need to track this in an accountable way, and that's why we're really keen to look at this in practice. We're currently working with 60 countries on this Green List Standard, with more than 600 sites as candidate sites, and we're hoping to scale that up in the framework of the GBF to at least 100 countries and 6,000 sites as emblematic of what can be achieved in practice. I'd like to just touch on a couple of other points. We must conserve the oceans. We've seen a great surge in interest in the oceans, and in particular, the importance of looking at the oceans as part of a regenerative blue economy that can benefit millions of people while conserving marine and coastal biodiversity. Thirdly, we've got to scale up species conservation. It was great to hear from CITES. We've got to improve the status of wild species, of course, ensuring that their use is safe, legal, and sustainable. And we're putting in place the Global Species Action Plan as a mechanism to support that implementation. I hope to be able to support that through my center. We are and must restore degraded ecosystems globally and support the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We've piloted many processes to do that in practice. We have many places where it's evident that this can be achieved. And of course, we've got to pull our efforts together to ensure sufficient funding goes to nature. The world has to increase investments from all sources to ensure implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And of course, we're hearing that language in the discussions that we've got to redirect harmful use of finance, harmful subsidies, markedly to be able to do that in an appropriate way. Across our program of action, we're mobilizing many grant-making programs to try and ensure that funding gets to local actors where we know that actual effectiveness takes place. Of course, there's the big picture issues, but there's also the practice in places. We really welcome the political commitment at the highest level that came through the first segment of COP15. But all of us, I think, have also witnessed the painfully slow pace of negotiations when it comes to the actual words and text. As we are hearing on the current days from the UNFCCC, the negotiating positions of parties fall way short of the high-minded political statements, and that gap has to be addressed. I think that's something that came strongly from Kunming. And how do we actually address that gap? We recognize, as others have mentioned today, the inextricable links between climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and how that is being manifested in the challenges the world is facing. While each convention and each instrument is separate, perhaps too separate, the Global Biodiversity Framework offers us the ability to bring some of these together for an efficient way of addressing some of the problems. Most of the solutions are common solutions, as was stated in the beginning. I also have good news, as Marta has said. The good news is that biodiversity conservation is out there. It's already there. It's a foundation for addressing both climate change and social and environmental challenges and economic challenges in the world. Of course, that needs investment, but it also needs a mobilization of all actors. We can address these crises simultaneously in efficiency And we can draw on the knowledge and traditions of people who have been conserving nature patently to the present day to harness that and to make sure that persists into the future. As we move forward to the next steps here in Geneva, IUCN really looks forward to strengthening our partnership, achieving together that sustainable world. And we, of course, are bringing together our members, our partners, our programs, our projects, right behind this ambition. Just for everyone's benefit, I just wanted to drop into the chat a link to a little video that the World Commission on Protected Areas put out just this morning for Glasgow, but it's perfectly relevant to the discussion that we're having today. So thank you so much, Chair, for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much, Trevor, from this perspective, from the conservation angle, and thank you for reminding us also that the slow pace of negotiation has to be put in parallel with indeed the very rapid changing environment, which has its impact on any effort when it comes to conservation. Thank you so much. Now, can I turn to Lin Lee, who is the Director of the Global Policy and Advocacy on the Worldwide Fund for Nature.
Thank you, Sylvie, and I'm happy to stay here to representing our Marco Lambertini, our Director General from WWF International. I was actually in Kunming on site to experience all that Isabel has shared, the excitement, the movement, and also I, encouraged by all the science, all the actions there. We still know that there are much more need to be done to restore the nature that we are currently destroying, so that we can really sustain us to achieve the theme of COP15, towards ecological civilization, build a shared future for all life on Earth. So here I like to share the four points. If other has said, I will say less. If other not, I will say a little bit more, but 4 points. The first point is that I think the Global Biodiversity Framework under the auspices of CBD should be the leading governing body for all global biodiversity. I think this has mentioned by Yvonne, by Martha, by all the others, saying the Global Biodiversity Framework is the framework for all of us, all the conventions, all the MEAs, all the regional conventions, all that, to really have a blueprint to manage all our biodiversity for the world. I think in the past, this was seen as just biodiversity communities framework. I think we now need to really look beyond our own community, looking at the whole planetary. And this is the framework for the climate community, for the economic community, for the social community. So I think that's the first point I want to make, is that we, the global biodiversity framework under the CBD, need to think about where are the governing, where are the, we have the responsibility for managing systematic use all the biodiversity for all of us on Earth. So that's my first point I want to say, and I didn't hear others saying that enough. So that's first point. My second point is that we have seen outside the negotiation room of CBD huge groundswell movements. Political will and commitments are really on CBD, on nature, are growing and growing strong. That's coming from, government leaders, from academic leaders, from business leaders, from indigenous peoples leaders, from youth, from women, from financiers, investors, from climate community. Actually, at the same time, we're talking here, the forest, as Elizabeth mentioned, the nature theme in the UNCCC are really strong as well. And also we have the IUCN, as Trevor mentioned, the Leaders Summit, COP15, Part 1, all that, you name it. I think this strong movement outside the negotiation room is forming, and it's going strong and growing. Yeah, that's my second point. The third point is that we also see the encouraging signs of not only talking about protection, restoration, and sustainable management, but also talk about changing our consumption, our lifestyle, reform our economic system, reforming our financial systems, who are really the driving forces behind biodiversity loss that we have been experiencing. And I also noticed in my listening or attending all the high-level events, I hear this nature positive and zero emission economy mentioned so many times. When this nature positive as a global goal has been coined just a year ago, I think that time was people started asking what is the nature positive. But nowadays, almost all the bigger, higher level events, you can hear the global leaders talk about we need a nature positive economy. We need a net zero emission economy. We need a transforming our ecosystems, transform our economic systems. I think this really encourages science that we can see that the global progressive thinkers and the global leaders has seen the driving forces behind biodiversity loss and starting to tackle that. And the global goal, using nature positive for nature as a global goal, is forming its trend now. So that's my third point. My fourth point is that with all this encouraging science and global movement, if we don't lend them into the national actions or into the global decisions, global framework, if we don't land them in there, the words will only remain words and will not bring the changes that we need to reverse loss of biodiversity, to really reduce, to peak and then to be climate neutral. Therefore, I would just make a few suggestions of going forward when we go into the January meeting, going to April meeting, go to COP15 Part 2. I think there are a few key elements should be reflected into the Global Biodiversity Framework by all the parties that are around the table, and also the civil societies like us, the non-government organizations like us would really help and be there to work together. So a few proposals. First of all, we need a mission to really reverse the natural loss to be nature positive by 2030, so that we can really go, achieve sustainable development, achieve this ecological civilization, achieve the 2015 vision of the CBD. That's the first one. Then we need to put halving of the footprint of our production and consumption into the Global Biodiversity Framework, because protection will only do us so much. Then we have to really reduce the pressure caused by our unsustainable production and consumption and lifestyle patterns. We need strong implementation mechanisms to make sure that we deliver what we promise and ratcheting our actions when it's needed. We also need to mobilize sufficient financial resources to be able to finding the solutions, nature-based solutions, one of them, to find the rights-based, equitable solutions to go. And this one we see today actually at the COP26, and also in September at the leaders event, and in COP15, we see the sparkling of commitments, financial commitments from countries, from philanthropists, from companies are really joining. So it's a good sign, but eventually we need to build that into the GBF and to have a target so that we can all working together. We also need to have a rights-based approach and to have a whole of society approach to ensure the IPLCs, indigenous peoples and local communities who are guardian of our rich biodiversity, their rights recognized, their contribution recognized, their participation included in us looking for the future. And a nature-based solution is a connector. It's a natural connector connecting nature and the climate change, so that we strive for mitigating reduced emission, but through the nature-based solution to build the resilience and absorbing for the shocks. Then all this will be able to help us to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2030, which is the most prestigious nature that's needed, and then restore what we lost and sustainably manage the rest. Only by working like this, I think, addressing the economic drivers of biodiversity loss and protection itself and sustainable use of them, we will be able to really bring the whole of society, whole of government, all in this together, so that we would have that transformation that's needed to really go towards that nature positive economy that we are all striving, we are all aspiring for. And we, WWF and many other players, we're standing together, working together, because this is the planet for all of us, and we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, yes, we are all in this together indeed. So unfortunately, looking at the clock, I'm being reminded that we went over time. I'm very sorry about the questions which came in to the panelists, a few very interesting ones, but we will be following up on the answers separately. So for the participants who ask questions, do not worry, your questions will be answered by the panelists, so no worry about that. Without any further ado, then I would like to thank all of you very, very much. That was a very substantive discussion, and I think we learned a lot, at least that we are all walking on the same path. I would like, if you allow me, to give the last word to Elisabeth Rema, maybe some takeaway messages, and how can we engage in the meaningful manner when CBD is coming back in Geneva early next year. Over to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you very much. And I will use that opportunity just to answer the question I see with regards to the chemicals and biodiversity. Simply, please check targets 7, 16, and 19. 7 is specifically on reducing pollution from all sources, including at least half from nutrients and 2/3 pesticides, including also discharge of plastics. So chemicals, again, you can see yourself there. And then relevant to that is target 16 and 19. My key message here is, as I said at the beginning, the parties to the CBD are the parties to the other biodiversity and chemical conventions. They are the same governments. We will be meeting in January, and the meeting will be both in person and virtual. So please, let's urge your parties also to participate and attend the January meetings virtually if they will not be in person in Geneva. They may be restricted to speak, but hopefully they can speak through their delegations, which will be in presence in person in Geneva. So again, the virtual mechanism gives us and them that ability to participate and contribute through their delegations. Otherwise, again, Sylvia, the Geneva office, thank you very much for organizing this briefing and looking forward to continue collaborating with you all as we move this common agenda forward. Thank you.
With pleasure. Diana, do you want to have some last communication maybe before we separate?
Yes, just to thank you all and also to thank you, Sylvie, for the excellent moderation of this event. To remind you that the video of this event, the summary, some of the links mentioned will be available on the webpage of the event, and we all look forward to continue engaging in the run-up to the meeting that will take place in Geneva in January. And we will be there at the service of the colleagues from the Convention on Biological Diversity to help them during their stay in Geneva. We had also a few member states online that are also looking forward to engage, and so we will certainly continue the discussion that way. So with that, just for our audience, we have a few events coming up. The Greek Geneva Science Day on 17th of November, and the next session of our nature-based solutions dialogues, which will focus on water on the 22nd of November, that we are co-organizing with our colleagues and friends of IUCN. With that, thank you all, and see you latest in January.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.